Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Scientia. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful, warm, summer-like afternoon. I'm Jim Pomerantz, Professor of Psychology and Director of Scientia, and this is our sixth lecture of the academic year in a series that I hope you're finding illuminating, if not necessarily always enjoyable, one whose theme is entitled Conflict, Violence, and War. We're very fortunate to have as our speaker today a widely known and widely admired member of the Rice faculty from Rice's Department of Political Science. That's Rick Wilson, and I'll be pleased to introduce him in just a moment. But let me, as usual, help remind ourselves of the theme that we're pursuing this year. Again, the topic is conflict, violence, and war, and this theme is developed, as always, by a group of Rice faculty members headed this year by David Queller, who put together the program, and you can read more about the program and the other speakers and their bios on our website. To refresh our memories, the program description for this year reads as follows, in part: the desire for peace and tranquility may run deep in the human spirit, but conflict, violence, and war have been nearly ubiquitous hallmarks of our past. This year's series will examine the nature and origins of violent conflict, not only in modern-day warfare and throughout human history, but in its evolutionary roots within animal species. By examining a spectrum extending from the appearance of violence in images to competition versus cooperation and experimental gaming and bargaining situations, that would be Professor Wilson's talk today, we'll look at we will examine the causes and possible purposes of violent behavior, as well as what might be done to contain violence in the future. So following Rick's talk today, we'll be resuming our schedule on March 15th, we hope, with a Bachner lecture. It's not yet been scheduled, but we are hard at work on it and hope very much that that date holds. So we will send out notices as soon as we've got that settled down. And then finally, closing out our year, we'll have Professor Dave Schneider sitting down here from the psychology department, who will be talking to us, obviously, from the perspective of a social psychologist. So bear with us as we complete our spring schedule, and as always, if you have ideas for themes next year and in future years, be sure to send them my way. So I mentioned last time that Scientia is involved in sponsoring another event, and that is the upcoming DeLange Conference on March 7th through 9th. It's on frontiers of medicine, society, pharmacology, and membrane biology in the genomic era. The only thing that's new since last time is that this conference is just about sold out. I shouldn't say sold out because it's free, courtesy of Hank and Damaris Hudspeth, but the seats are just about all gone. So if you're interested in attending, you should get on the website and register as quickly as possible. That takes place during the Rice spring break. Let me note our format as usual. Rick will speak, I presume, for the usual academic unit of time, 50 or 60 minutes, followed by 15 minutes or so of questions and answers, and then we'll go out into the lobby for cheese and beverage reception, where you can talk with Rick and amongst yourselves. So now for the reason why we're all here today, to hear from Rick Wilson of Rice's Political Science Department. I say from Political Science Department, but Rick has links, formal links, actually real links with two other departments at Rice, namely statistics and my own department, psychology, where Rick shows up all the time and feels like a member of the faculty, adding greatly to our program, deepening our bench and broadening our scope at the same time. Historically, most political scientists have focused on observing human behavior in the wild, so to speak, seeing how people interact in real-world situations characterized by conflict or by competition. But Rick's in the forefront of a new wave of political scientists who don't merely observe behavior, but who create situations and control environments in which people interact. In other words, Rick does actual experiments. I think he even owns a white lab coat. And he conducts those experiments both here and as far away as Siberia, where I can picture him wearing 2 or perhaps 3 lab coats to deal with the weather. We will get to hear some of his results, perhaps from there, but certainly from here in Houston in just a few moments. By way of formalities, Rick received his bachelor's degree from Creighton in 1975 and a master's in history, Creighton in 1977. In fact, there are 2 people in the room who have received master's degrees in history from Creighton, and they apparently get together and do secret handshakes from time to time. And finally, his PhD in political science from Indiana University in 1982. He then went and did a visiting lectureship at WashU in St. Louis and joined us down at Rice the following year, 1983, where he's been ever since, with the exception of this recreational time in Siberia. And a 3-year stint in Washington, D.C., where he served as program director for political science at the National Science Foundation. He was promoted to full professor in 1995, and in the year 2003, he was named the Herbert S. Autry Professor of Political Science. So Rick conducts experiments on strategic choice and the development of cooperation in bargaining games. He's going to be giving us, I think, a sort of an optimistic turn on an otherwise fairly dismal and pessimistic series that we've heard so far this year. His work has been sponsored, as you can see, by the National Science Foundation and also by the Behavioral Research Lab at Rice, which is over at the corner of Greenbrier University, if people have wondered what goes on in that odd little building over there. Rick is the author, he's an expert in the area of evolution of American politics and is the co-author of Congressional Dynamics, Structure, Coordination, and Choice in the First American Congress, 1774 through 1789, which was published by Stanford University Press in 1994 and has a large number of publications in other journals, including the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organizations, Political Analysis, and the Journal of Conflict Resolution. Rick has also shed blood for Rice as well, serving as department chair back from 1991 to 94. I had to share the blame for that, I guess. But in fact, he's serving as chair again right now, and I can't think of what would give him better preparation for speaking in a series on conflict, war, and violence than serving as an academic department chair. No rest for the weary. So let me, as always, ask you to turn off your pagers, cell phones, anything else that beeps, and give a warm welcome to Rick Wilson from Political Science, whose title is In Others We Trust, Roots of Human Cooperation and Conflict. Rick Wilson.
Well, I hope to bring a little more levity to this topic of discussion. I did start out, I have listened to all the talks so far, and it seems to me that the conclusion that we'd reach had we just attended these lectures is that violence is pretty much an innate part of human characteristics. It's something that we can't shed, we're unlikely to shed. There's a strong cultural component in which we learn on how to behave or misbehave, as the case may be, and I would take the game of hockey as one in which a cultural environment of violence is often addressed. And likewise, I think we clearly know that there's an institutional form of violence that directs us. But this might lead us to conclude that humans and humankind are the scourge of the planet, much more violent than practically any other species around, and maybe we should do away with ourselves. However, I want to come to you with a little more positive message, which is to say, instead of humans merely being engaged in violence, it turns out, I think there's widespread cooperative behavior at work, and what I want to do is try and convince you today that there is some possibility that humans are not merely violent creatures, but rather we have cooperative tendencies that allow us to get around violence. But the way in which I'm going to do that is going to take you in kind of a long journey, so if you'll bear with me, I'll try and get you there without inflicting too much violence on you as it is. Now, the one, as an outline, let me just give you a sense of where I'd like to go. I'd like to talk a little bit about the likelihood of cooperative behavior, and humans, like other animals, have to navigate the 4 Fs. We have to worry about fighting, fleeing, feeding, and mating. And all of these are functions of animals that require a good deal of navigating a very socially complex dynamic. We're no different than most animals in this respect. And I'm going to make the argument that this is grounded in 3 things: altruism, strong reciprocity, and pro-social preferences. And I'll come back and define those in a bit. I also want to then provide you with some empirical evidence for cooperative behavior along these dimensions and what these dimensions imply. And in doing so, I'm going to talk specifically about altruistic behavior. I want to talk a good deal about norms and the structure of norms. I want to talk about collective action, which I'll also call coordination in some respects. And I'll then want to talk about trust, which I think is a very complex form of social behavior. At the end, I want to speculate a bit and leave it for my colleague Dave Schneider to pick up on this, about the interaction between the innate characteristics of humans, if there are such things, and the social, political, and economic institutions that we construct to try and control and redirect our behavior. So hang on for the ride. In terms of cooperation, there's several sources that we might think about. We might think about kinship relations with altruistic behavior. We may think about something called strong reciprocity, which reciprocity occurs, across non-kin types. It's merely a form of exchange, a form of watching over one another. And we might want to talk about pro-social preferences as well, the willingness to go out and do something for others. And again, I'm going to define each of these terms as I get to them. Well, these underlying characteristics of humans and other animals are going to give rise to things like, I've noted, altruistic behavior, norms, and the mechanism for the enforcement of norms. I'm going to talk not just about norms as a set of behaviors that are nice, but I'm also going to talk about norms as providing the mechanism for punishment. I also want to talk about cooperation, or what I'll call collective action, and like I said, finally, trust. Okay, so altruism. Altruism is pretty straightforward. It's merely providing a costly benefit to another. So on my little diagram, you'll see lots of these little stick diagrams. You'll see the yellow person unilaterally giving something to a purple person. At another point in time, the yellow person may give something to a gray person. There's no sense here of any return. It's merely doing, merely the willingness to engage in what you might call unconditional kindness. Now, as somebody who roots around with economics a bit, I'm going to think of that as the willingness to give money to someone. And I'll get to that in a little bit. Now, under what circumstances might you expect altruistic behavior to occur? Well, animal ethologists have talked at length about kinship structures and the willingness to provide a benefit to a costly benefit to another, especially in a kin-based circumstance. And you could argue that really that isn't altruism, that's merely ensuring ongoing passing on genes. Kinship's interesting, but I don't think we see altruism merely among kin. There's also non-kinship-based relations, and again, animal ethologists have been really interested in these, and so have many social scientists. Rather than thinking merely about non-kin relations, we might think about people living in very dense networks of neighborhoods in which you have a good deal of information about those around you. You've engaged in extensive relationships with those people, and so it seems natural to think about people maybe trading back and forth or providing costly benefits to others. But within a dense network, it may be that that's merely a form of reciprocity, as I'll get to. Okay, so globally, we might ask the question as whether or not altruism, this willingness to engage in unconditional kindness, is widely available. Now, what about strong reciprocity? Well, reciprocity itself, I'm not going to put the term strong on here yet, really just means the repaying of costs incurred by others. And so in my little diagram here, you can see the yellow guy giving something to the purple guy. Some time passes, and the purple guy then reciprocates by giving something back to the yellow guy. And so reciprocity could be nothing more than that. And in order to have a form of reciprocity like that, you pretty much need a reputational mechanism in which, if I'm the yellow guy, I know who the purple guy is, and I know whether that purple guy is likely to return something back to me, and so I kind of account for that. I have to be able to monitor his actions, make sure he does what he's supposed to do, and so forth. I also have to have some kind of mental accounting scheme in order to keep track of the purple guy. Oh, geez, does he owe me a favor now? I did something for him. You know, am I going to get repaid on that? It's a very complicated form of thinking about reciprocity, especially when you may engage in reciprocal relationships with lots and lots of people. Okay, we may not be, I don't know about you, I can't account for more than about 3 things at once and probably not more than 10 people at once. But if I'm dealing with hundreds of people, I can't even keep track of my department, and we're very small. It's very difficult to remember who owes who favors, and yet that would be an implication of reciprocity. Well, there's another version of reciprocity that's a little more interesting, this notion of strong reciprocity. And it requires, again, the yellow guy giving something to the purple guy, some time passing, the purple guy passing something on to the gray guy, and then time passing and the gray guy passing something back to the yellow guy. Well, to think about this form of strong reciprocity, it requires an unconditional willingness to bear the cost, to incur the cost, to pay the cost, to give something to someone. At the same time, it requires an expectation of an indirect repayment. That is, I don't have to keep track of the gray guy, or of the purple guy giving me something back. I just know if I pay somebody off or if I do a favor for someone that somehow it's going to be reciprocated to me at some point in time. Now, how do you sustain something like that? Well, cultural institutions are pretty good about taking care of this reputational and monitoring and even this accounting mechanism. We learn a lot of behaviors that lead us to be willing to engage in a form of reciprocity. Okay, finally, pro-social preferences. Let me start by talking about a simple story of collective action. This is where a group of people get together on the Rice campus. It would be, of course, a room getting a keg, and which, of course, would only happen for those who are 21 or older on this campus, of course, and then soliciting contributions and having people simply pay as they come in without anybody monitoring and making sure that the keg is provided for. But, of course, everyone's going to have an incentive to come in and simply grab a sip of beer and wander off without making the payment. The apocryphal story that's typically told about collective action problems, of course, are the Chinese barge pullers who pulled barges as a team for a wage. But the problem with pulling a barge is that everyone has an incentive to shirk. I mean, you know, I can feign that I'm really pulling that barge really well, and, you know, my rest of my colleagues may not be able to tell how much energy I'm exerting in order to do so. So they may believe that, in fact, I'm contributing. Now, everybody realizes there's a problem with shirking, and everybody decides, well, if he's going to shirk, then I'm going to shirk, and everybody decides to shirk. So the barges don't get pulled very efficiently or very well. Chinese teams resolve this problem by jointly coming together, taking a portion of their wage, and hiring someone to walk behind them and whip them. Which is one way of solving the problem of collective action. Now, I didn't have a picture of Chinese barge pullers, but I do have a picture of the only remaining ferry that exists that goes into the United States that's actually pulled by human beings. This is down in the valley. Okay. But there are also other forms of pro-social preferences where people will get together to work, in which everybody, like I said, is better off if you jointly pay the cost, but there's a strong incentive for everyone to cheat. We all know this problem. It happens extensively in all of our departments or in our daily lives. Jim, I'm sorry, I'm sounding very bitter about my department these days. No, it's not true. They're a fine bunch. Okay, but what does it require to have pro-social preferences? First of all, it requires that you be able to conditionally cooperate. That is, you have a sense in which you pick and choose among those settings in which you will choose to cooperate in the sense of contributing to the public good in this sense, or contributing, as I've noticed. And the second thing that it requires is a willingness to punish. In fact, punish those who don't contribute to the public good, the collective good. And how is it sustained? Well, sustained often, people claim, by social emotions, such as shame, guilt, empathy. Also may be supported by social, political, and economic institutions. Okay, on to altruistic behavior. There's a lot of, so altruism, if it exists in humans, if it's innate, can give rise to altruistic behavior. So we all know stories of people who rush out onto the ice to rescue someone who's fallen in, putting themselves at grave risk. So again, paying a rather severe cost to rescue often a non-kin member. He obviously was safe. He was tied to something. But you might think of people coming together to rescue the child from a burning window, in which, again, they're not obviously kin-related. Problem with observing altruistic behavior, of course, is that it's difficult to collect lots of observations. And I'm enough of a social scientist to want to look at observations and observe things. And if I can't go around creating situations in which people are in great danger, maybe I'll just go into my lab and try and replicate a mechanism in which people have to make costly choices. And in fact, that's what I do, along with a large number of other people, largely under the rubric of experimental economics. So what I'm going to take you through is a bit of a test of how we would get at altruistic behavior and try and understand whether there are altruistic preferences. Well, let me use something called the Dictator Game. It's a fairly straightforward game in which you take two people. And the standard approach here is to take two individuals. They're going to be randomly matched. They're strangers for all intents and purposes. Hence, I have the little brick wall between the yellow person and the purple person. They can't see each other. And what they have to do is you ask the question, how much will be given by one party to the other? That's all that's asked. Now, the standard approach might be to simply ask, well, how much would you give? Make it a hypothetical, and it's very easy. If I ask Jim, gee, Jim, here's $1,000. You can split it between me and some randomly chosen, between yourself and some randomly chosen person here. Jim would say, oh, gee, I'll look like a nice guy, and if it doesn't cost me anything, if it's hypothetical, I'll just give, what would you give? Like 900 out of the 1,000, probably. Okay. I'd rather move into the lab and ask, how much will you give? And actually make the offer and force you to think about what it's going to cost you when you have the money in your hot little hands there. So I'm going to be doing this with lots of students, and other people have done this as well. The claim is this measures pure altruism, or altruism in the sense that I stated it, of being willing to pay the cost of engaging in a particular form of action. Okay, so the standard design, take two people, give one of them some money, and see how they split the money. Okay? And the amount sent is a measure typically of how much altruism, how much of a willingness people are to engage in this behavior. Well, if you take a look at sort of standard results from the Dictator Game, what you get is you actually get a lot of contributions, or a lot of money given to the other person. Okay, in fact, the distribution is up here on the side panels, and you can see that there's a lot of non-zero contributions. The means here are usually about 20 to 30% of the money. That is, if I walk into a lab and I hand somebody $10 and say, divide this up, people will keep about $7, send 3. Now, in fact, they ought to send nothing. Why should they send anything at all? There's no constraint on them. They're not observed. There's nothing going on here that would force them otherwise. Well, it may be the case that there's a little bit of social propriety involved here. And so what happens if you eliminate the social distance? So in an experimentalist sense, what if you run a double-blind experiment in which the experimenter doesn't know, the other person doesn't know what's being sent, etc. You can now drive behavior back to zero, sending very little. You can decrease the mean contributions. And so you can get around 59, 60% of the population will send absolutely nothing under this circumstance, but you still have 40% of the population who's willing to send something. Okay, so this raises kind of an interesting question. These are all students. Maybe students don't matter. Maybe they're not normals. So I decided what would happen if we went to a transitional society and tried running an equivalent game in a setting for very high stakes, in which we look at population samples. And so I was given the opportunity to go off to Russia and run these experiments. And this gives you a little sense of where we were running these things. We did a two-part structure on this. We surveyed a large chunk of the population, about 2,700 people in 2 different republics. We then went and recruited about a quarter of those people and brought them into experiments that I'll be telling you about, including the Dictator Game. As you can see, we decided not to stay in the usual luxury places of Moscow and St. Petersburg, but rather went to Tatarstan and then out in Sakha, where my daughter joined me as a field worker and has barely forgiven me, even though that was 2 years ago, but nonetheless. Tatarstan's a pretty decent place. This is an urban setting in Tatarstan, a nice town, somewhat Eastern European still, but not Asian. But all the places where we were running experiments didn't stick with merely being in the urban areas. We were often in rural areas. I had a coding rule: if any time I saw a cow walking down Main Street, that was going to count that village as a rural area. And out in Sakha, this is the urban area in Sakha. Those are pipes that are running above ground. The ground, it's all on permafrost, and it's cold for much of the year. It happened to be warm for a couple months or a couple weeks while we were there in the summer. The smog in the picture is a function of forest fires. The taiga was burning, and nobody lives up there, so it wasn't worth putting out. It was very smoky. And then the rural areas are terribly rural as well. It's a very low density population. It's not completely removed from the center of the earth. In fact, capitalism is struck even there, and we did find, what, 3 shirts, I think, in the United Colors. Now, Jim mentioned my normal lab over at the Greenbrier lab. It's a very nice lab. I love my lab. You can see why I love my lab. This is in the best setting that we had in Sakha. I moved from computers to cardboard boxes to run my experiments and ran things by hand. In the worst of the settings, we had people piled on top of one another but kept our cardboard boxes. But it was much fun. Our subjects, has a little bit of information about them. In 2 different groups, Tatarstan and Sakha. The earnings were pretty substantial. For some people, these earnings amounted to more than 3 months' wages. The facilities were a little bit interesting sometimes. Sakha was quite interesting, actually. And getting around was often fun, too. All right, well, let me give you something on the Dictator Games here. Dictator Games are pretty interesting. On average, the wage rate that we were using, the stakes that they were splitting up were equivalent to about a half-day's pay. And what you see is the subjects are sitting at right around 50%, sending 50%. So almost half the subjects were sending half the amount that they received. And there's some distribution on each side. Some subjects were sending everything, not many. Some were keeping it all, but they look very different from the American students, if you recall. In fact, if you compare with the US sample, I've put both graphs up here. The little blue graph over in the corner is the US sample, and you can compare with what happens when subjects were asked to send money to people that were in the same republic as themselves or send it to a different republic as part of the experimental protocol. You can see there's a little bit of difference here on when people think about whether they're going to send money to someone who might be close to them, that is in the republic, versus someone who may be very far away. We were trying to decrease social distance and use strangers and all the rest. And we do find some drop-off in that, but it's not nearly the same extent as in the US. Again, these are with normals. It seems to be that there's something going on. The average amount sent, here, I'll just throw up a little bit of data here for you. What we are finding, I won't mention too much, is we're finding really clear generational differences. We suspect that norms are starting to break down in the Soviet Union, but that's a whole nother talk, and I won't go spend too much time on that. What I do want to say is that these results, combined with lots and lots of other results from the Dictator Game, seem to indicate that there's a strong disposition among humans toward costly altruism. And that holds up not only in my locations, but other people who've run these experiments. Now, what I want to do is move to now thinking about strong reciprocity. And first, I want to deal with norms and the mechanisms for enforcement of norms. Now, there can be no doubt that norms are important. They're constantly used. People are constantly being trained on what the set of expectations are in behavior. In fact, that's what norms do. They build expectations for what others are going to do. Now, those expectations can be both positive expectations and negative expectations. As you can see, this is a picture of a positive expectation. Here's another positive expectation of helping out people who've put themselves in harm's way. The flip side to norms, though, is also thinking about who's going to enforce the cost of people who don't follow norms or who violate norms. Who's willing to bear those costs, and how will those costs be made? In fact, enforcing norms is often costly. Now, here you see a group of fans that are not really concerned with bearing the cost. In fact, it may be part of the price of admission to a baseball game, and they're certainly willing to jeer on a player. And you can see other examples, for those of you who remember the civil rights movement, of people enforcing norms in perhaps a costless way. But it is costly to go off and enforce norms, no matter which side those that you might be on. Okay, let me discuss then the Ultimatum Game, which tries to get at the norms that are in place in a society or in a community. And I want to talk about this game as a test of what people's expectations are for what others will do in this context. And the game is also nice in the sense that it's a game of negative reciprocity. So it goes against the version of reciprocity that I mentioned at the outset. In fact, instead of dealing with the concept of strong reciprocity, it's really a notion of, did I get what I expected? And if I didn't, I'm going to then punish that person. And you do it in the following way. The theoretical structure to the Ultimatum Game is very simple. I'm player A. I have some amount of money. Here I've put up 160. It's 160 rubles. It's about a day's wage in Tatarstan. And the blue player, player A, gets to decide how they want to allocate that money. It's just like the Dictator Game. Unilaterally decide how much of a split to offer. Okay? Now, the game theoretic expectation on this, and all these are derived from pure, simple game theoretic models, bargaining models, is that all I should do is to give a trivial amount. So if Jim and I were playing this game, I love to pick on Jim, if I had 160 rubles and I'm making Jim an offer, what I should do is offer him 1 ruble. I should keep 159. Jim's not going to turn that down. He's looking at a bird in the hand, so why not? I'll keep it. But the nature of the game is the following. Player B then gets to make a decision. And player B's decision is to accept or reject the offer. If the offer is accepted, if Jim accepted my token offer of 1 ruble, he'd keep his 1 ruble, I'd keep my 159, and we'd both walk away. He'd be unhappy, but he'd be a ruble richer. I'd be very pleased, I'd be much richer. But Jim could say, forget it, that's not enough. And as a consequence, I'm willing to take 0, and you're going to get 0 also. So in this game, if the offer is rejected, we both walk away with nothing. The money is scooped up, and that's it. So now you have to think, as a subject, as an individual, how much should I offer? What's the norm? And if I don't meet the norm, will I be rejected? Well, the standard design in this experiment is to have one subject be the offerer, usually randomly selected. That person gets to decide what offer to make. Randomly paired with another individual who then gets to decide whether to accept or reject the offer. There's a couple of different ways of playing this game, but this is the simplest version. The offer is then made, subjects are matched, and they're paid or not paid. depending on whether the offer is accepted or rejected. Okay, so what are the standard results? Well, the standard results are pretty straightforward. Offers typically tend to be in the 35 to 50% range. The data I'm putting up here are actually results from a high-stakes game in which the offers being split were about was $400. So this was real money for students. These weren't games that I ran. My NSF grant isn't quite that munificent, but nonetheless, what you can see is a piling up of the distribution. You might expect people to go directly to 50-50, but they don't. They shave on the offers a bit over here, making 30 or 40% of an offer. A couple of people are really risk averse and offering offers giving people 60% of the money and keeping 40% for themselves. But you do see a group that are making a 20% offer. You see nobody making very tiny or zero offers in these games. So the offers tend to clump up even under moderate stakes or low stakes. They tend to have the same distribution. Offers are rarely rejected. The exception is in offers that are 20% or less tend to be rejected with about half the time. And in fact, in these high-stakes games, the gold bars are the conditional frequency of rejections. So of the, let's see, 28% of the offers that were made at around 20%, 55% of those offers were rejected. But you can see people's patterns of rejections go down. You even see some rejections at a 50-50 split here. This is not unusual in these experiments. So that's the standard results. Well, what happens when I use what I'll call my normals, the Russians? Well, they play exactly the same game. They're playing the same game for a full day's wage. This is 160 rubles in Tatarstan or 240 rubles in Sakha. So what do we find? We find people almost immediately go to a 50-50 split. Almost 70% of the subjects are offering 50-50. So the offers are at 50%. That's not unusual. But what happens on the rejection side? Well, we get a similar pattern of rejections for very low offers. They're rejected almost all the time. And those rejections go down. But the weird thing that happens is people are also rejecting offers where they're being offered more than their fair share. Okay, so we did have a couple of subjects who offered 100%, and they were rejected. Now, we thought, okay, well, maybe they didn't understand the instructions, maybe they were unclear, maybe they were drunk, which was not unusual in some of the experiments, but I can discount most of those. So another group of people went out and decided, okay, well, maybe these people are all acculturated and so forth. And so there's a 15-nation study in which the maps are in pretty good shape, in which anthropologists went out and looked at different groups ranging from Mongolia to the Machigenga in Ecuador to the Aceh in Paraguay and so forth, and decided to run the same kind of game among a mix of pastoralist groups, among hunter-gatherers, and some people had a little bit of market integration. Now, the results from that study are a little bit variable. And let me put up just a different kind of graph to give you a sense. This sort of ranges people from, these bubbles indicate the proportion of people who are making that offer. As you can see, at least these large groups, including the ORMA and those from Pittsburgh, which was thrown as part of the study, are all giving around half. They look a lot like the Russians, in a sense. And as you move down the scale, you see the Machigenga and the Quechua are making much, much smaller offers. And again, there's a lot of noise in these data, but these, that's what the data look like. And the variable offers are linked to characteristics about gift norms in society, market integration of those society, and so forth. On the rejection side, the offers that are made, we're again getting a similar pattern. It's pretty much the case that low offers, at least in this upper group, are usually being rejected. At least offers, under 20% or so. We don't find that among the groups that make low offers in the first place. They rarely reject anything that they get, as if it's a norm or an expectation. And likewise, these guys get the same thing we get, people rejecting high offers. It's just not right. And in fact, when we talked to our Russians after they'd rejected an offer of, let's say, all the money, I said, that isn't right. It's not fair. It's not part of the way we are, and we shouldn't accept that. So we're willing to make costly punishments in these cases. Okay. I want to come back to this notion now of strong reciprocity, and I want to deal with the cooperation side. I've given you a little bit of stuff concerning norms. Now let me move over to a different component of this. So I want to talk about this second part of the norms question, which is who bears the cost for punishing. So my old Russian babushkas who would tell me, no, it isn't fair. We need to, we need to bring people into line. They're bearing the cost. Why are they bearing the cost for this? Well, part of it is this problem of collective action. And so in some studies that I've done with a lot of other colleagues, let's think about the problem of collective action. As I've already mentioned, let's take just the standard dilemma, or a social dilemma, or a commons dilemma, however you want to think about it, in which you play this game with a lot of people, and you think about the number of others who might contribute, and you get some set of payoffs from your contribution and the others. And so let's make it simple. Your contributions are linear with the number of others who are also willing to contribute. And so the usual story is behind that game is it's really simple. The more people who contribute, the better off everyone is. But it's also the case that if you don't contribute, you're much better off not contributing all the time. In fact, the cost of contribution is that amount. So no matter how many other people contribute, you always have an incentive not to contribute. Okay? Well, we have a game that we've designed to test this. It's the voluntary contribution mechanism, or public goods game, in which we usually start with a group of people. They're all given some money, and they can put that money into a pot. They can keep some of the money for themselves. They can keep money for themselves, or they can put money into the pot. They can do some mix of the two things. It's entirely up to you. And whatever is put into the pot then grows, and it's usually doubled, tripled, quadrupled by the experimenter. And then whatever's in that group pot is divided by n, the number of players, and everybody gets a share. So, of course, the best thing to do is for Jim and Dave and I to play this game, and for those guys to contribute all their money into the pot, make the pot grow really big, and for me to keep as much as possible and take a third of a share of this game. And hope that they don't realize that I did that afterwards and they don't beat me up, which would only mean that they're willing to bear the cost of punishment in that case. Well, yeah, yes. Unfortunately, that is the case. That's why we run these in anonymous experiments. I love to run them over the internet where these people never meet, because they do get mad. So the standard results for these VCM games, this is a game, one that I ran, that doesn't quite, it's a little higher than usual, but the standard result is people start out somewhere between making an initial contribution of 35 to 50%. And then they play this game repeatedly, either with the same group or a new group or such not. The design components are variable. But what typically happens is after the first couple of periods of contributions, people realize, wait a minute, this game is going nowhere. And so what they do is you see a gradual decline, usually going to 0 by about the 15th round, and so you see a downward slide in contributions. People learn not to contribute to the public good. Now, it does help when you introduce the ability for people to talk to one another in these games, and so you do bring them together, and they can talk. They can engage in what's called cheap talk, non-binding communication with one another, and when you do that, suddenly contributions go way up. almost to 100%. They're usually sustained. So communication helps. Bringing people together face-to-face seems to help. What we do discover that if you can figure out who the liars are in these games, though, it doesn't help at all. And in fact, some experiments that I ran actually did look at liars. And what happens in these games is that you don't even start off as high in the early levels, and you go basically no better than the baseline treatment, and you gradually crash. Now, the variation on liars here is the ability to make, in this experiment, people are able to say what they're going to contribute, and then the contributions occur, and then you get a list, and you can see what people said and what they did afterwards, even though we don't identify IDs with names in these games for fear of the beating that might occur afterwards. So, what we do find is that being able to track liars doesn't help in these games. Finally, what about punishment? Well, interestingly, Ernst Fair and colleagues have run games in which it's a standard VCM game that lasts 10 periods. You restart the game and you allow people to pinpoint who they want to pay a cost in order to punish people who did not provision the public good. What you see is the usual downward decline in the first 10 periods where there's no punishment. That's in the blue. The moment you invoke punishment, rates go way up, and they climb, and they're fairly well sustained. It's not quite 100% of the optimum, but it's fairly close. Okay. Finally, let me finally get to trust. That was the title of the talk, which I think this resembles pro-social preferences. So, trust, I think, is a very complex calculation that humans have to make. It involves you making yourself vulnerable to another. And it typically involves you making yourself vulnerable in many ways. I mean, for instance, some of you, I'm sure, probably go to a restaurant on occasion, walk up and take your keys out and flip your keys to the valet and walk in, thereby leaving your $15,000, $16,000, $30,000 car in someone else's hands, in which you have no expectation, or shouldn't have much of an expectation, that they're going to take care of it, much less return it, and yet you do. So we do have expectations of strong reciprocity built into these. Now, it may be that you think that in that kind of a trust game I just offered, where you throw your keys, that you would expect, oh man, the restaurant has bonded these people, the restaurant knows who these people are, there's a reputational effect, and so forth. Nonetheless, you're taking quite a risk here. Now, part of the argument about trust, in this sense of making yourself vulnerable but having an expectation of strong reciprocity, is that it makes life much simpler. In fact, Putnam and others, I'm sure you've read concerning social capital, talk about trust as being the glue of society, in which it holds us together. It means that we don't have to go around constantly suing one another in order to accommodate our interests. We can simply depend on one another. Likewise, it reduces the transaction costs. If I go to the restaurant, I don't have to double check on who the valet parker is and whether they have enough of a bond and whether or not I'm actually going to get my car back unscratched. So it has some nice features to it. The theoretical problem is pretty straightforward. So here in a very simple game, again, I may just take two players, and I tell player A that you have $10. You can keep that money, or you can split it between yourself and a second player. Now, why should they ever do that? It sounds like the Ultimatum Game or the Dictator Game. Well, the money that's passed, let's say $10 is passed in this game, is tripled by the experimenter. So now there's a large pot of money, $30 in this case. And player B then gets to make a simple decision. Do I keep it all, send nothing back to the first player? Hence, the first player has made herself rather vulnerable to the second player. Or the second player could split it in some fashion. Here I do the simple binary version of this game. If you know anything about game theory, you shouldn't ever trust anyone. You shouldn't send your money on because they're going to be tempted to take it all. You won't get anything back. You've made yourself vulnerable. and it'll just go to show that you can't trust strangers. That seems to be at least the claim under sort of standard game theoretic results. Nonetheless, we can go ahead and test this in the lab, in which, again, I can take the yellow guy, I can give them a stack of money, I can tell them I'm going to triple that money. They're going to be matched with a stranger. That stranger is going to now have a much larger pot, and then the stranger has to decide how to reallocate that money in any units back to the yellow guy and how much he wants to keep for himself. Okay, standard results in the trust game, well, it's a lot more trust than we might expect. In fact, here's some results from one of the original trust games that were run back in the mid-90s. And let me point out some features on this funny red thing. The points are the payoffs both to the trustor and the trustee. The person who is trusted is the trustee. The person who sent the money is the trustor. Shows the joint payoffs between the two. And anything on this vertical break-even line that runs up and down is meant anything to the right of that vertical line means trust paid off. As you can see, trust didn't pay off for a lot of people. Some people, trusters sent everything and got nothing back. There was somebody who took it all. Some trusters sent just a little bit and didn't get any of it back, and so forth. But what you can also see is that there's some trust going on in here. In fact, in these games, trust doesn't quite pay off in the aggregate. You get back about $4.89 for every $5 that you send. So we find some reciprocation in trust. Well, again, these are with students, so let me compare these with my Russians. I had more cases here, and I've jittered these a bit so you can see. And the patterns look a little bit similar. A little more, actually, a lot more trust than the earlier games run under similar conditions. There's still a lot of people who are taking advantage here, but there's considerable trust that's occurring here, and there's variations on, how much trust and how much ought to be returned and so forth, including some people, including at least 2 cases, people who were sent everything. It was all tripled, and they sent it all back, being very nice. Okay, so there's considerable trust. What we're also finding in this is, again, for another paper, part of a book I'm working on, there's a lot of trust across ethnic groups. There's considerable reciprocity in all of this. And one of the interesting findings is there's a lot of variation in expectations. And those expectations are correlated with reciprocity. So if you expect to get a lot from your partner and you get it, you reward them. If you have high expectations and they didn't match, you punish them. That stands up in a lot of games. Okay, so I'm trying to get to the close here. What do we know? Well, first of all, we find that there's considerable selfless behavior out there. There's a lot of contributions in the Dictator Game. There's seemingly fairly strong reciprocity. We find that there are strong expectations concerning norms, and these show up in the Ultimatum Game results. We find a response to those expectations that occurs in the trust game data. We find that there's a fair amount of pro-social preferences out there in the world, cooperation in the voluntary contribution mechanism, at least under some formulations like communication or punishment. We find that people are conditional trusters quite often, and they're willing to punish. Okay, so people are pretty good about looking at the world around them. Now, it could be that these results are largely a function of a lot of other things rather than some innate structure of humans. And so I want to spend just a minute or two talking about this. So it could be that the results are due to things like a set of choice heuristics. Gee, I'm faced with a complicated problem. Here some American stranger has walked in, handed me a big wad of cash, and asked me to split it. My God, this has never happened to me before. What should I do? Well, 50-50 sounds good. That might be a reasonable expectation. Or it may be that you draw on the availability of whatever norms there are right there, or there may be some simple learned response over time. So those may be reasonable explanations for what we observe, and it may not be that it's innately built into our heads to think about altruism or to engage in pro-social preferences or so forth. So the question now is, does the presence of another, knowing that you have a partner, a counterpart in these experiments, make any difference? And so the question is, are those choices different when you know you have a human versus a non-human? So we play these games against robots, and sure enough, if you're playing against a computer versus a person, you behave very differently, which is nice to know. Question, though, remains, are you accounting for the others as you're making your decisions? So let me give you just a little quickie on a couple of things that people are beginning to play with, including myself. Do you have a representation of others? So let's use an electroencephalogram to try and measure electrical brain activity as subjects are playing these games. These are pretty dense nets. I've even tried them out myself. And we ask the very simple question of, do people, when they're playing a very, very simplified game, doing it multiple times, do we find differences in the way they conceptualize the game? Is there some circuitry firing as they're playing a game against a human versus a non-human? And we have some preliminary data. I'm sorry about these pictures, they're not very clear. But what we're getting, we take a couple of channels on the prefrontal cortex, both the left and right side. We're able to do lots of repetitions, smooth the signal out. And so we've taken channels kind of up in here. We can isolate those channels, and we find that there's differences in the two treatments. And that's what the red and blue lines are showing. What's important is seeing this is about 400, 500 milliseconds out from the key press of the decision. In all of these cases, that's what we're focused on, and we're looking at a specific set of channels, and we're seeing some difference in those results. This has been corroborated through functional magnetic resonance imaging, not that I've done, and these are a little fuzzy, in which Kevin McCabe, Vernon Smith, and colleagues have looked at responses under a similar kind of game. Here they're comparing, I believe, subjects playing against a computer versus a human subject, and they're looking at the lighting areas, again, on the medial prefrontal cortex, and finding fairly large differences at peak times under blood oxygen flows in the brain. Finally, one of my favorites is a strong willingness to punish that's been conducted using a PET test by Ernst Fehr and colleagues, in which they're looking for, in a trust game, of whether or not subjects, when they're given the option to punish someone for not meeting expectations in these games, whether there's something different that's lighting up. And they're looking, they have a whole range of treatments, and the comparison treatments here are when they have the ability to punish and not. And what they're finding is the nucleus caudate is getting a real big charge when they have the ability to punish. That's also showing up in the, let's see, left or right prefrontal cortex, medial prefrontal cortex, which is actually an extension of part of the dopamine system off the caudate. So in other words, people are getting real jollies out of punishing in these cases. They think it's the thing to do. And at least this is part of the interpretation that Ernst and others have offered. Okay, so let me go back through violence here. Is it innate? Well, there's an altruistic streak in us, and perhaps that altruistic streak tempers some of the aggressiveness that most of us have talked about in these talks. At the same time, there are cultural characteristics about, there are cultural mechanisms that enhance strong reciprocity, which is a form of obtaining indirect payments from others and the willingness to repay others. And those cultural institutions do a great deal, I believe, to support kinds of norms that might be, which might lessen violence. Likewise, there's a set of institutions out there that support pro-social norms. I think those institutions back trust for many of us. Political institutions certainly do. They help build trust, and they help provide guarantees for trustworthiness. I guess the question is whether or not human violence is inevitable. Are we doomed to constantly fighting, killing, and otherwise abusing one another? And I think that's the question, one of the questions to ask. I think what's important here, maybe I'll leave this for Dave to answer, is whether this mix between human nature and our social and political and economic institutions can somehow be integrated in the social sciences, whether we have a way of trying to understand and bring to bear some real answers about how these things work in combination. Tried to do some of that today. The question is whether, again, coming back to the inevitability of violence, well, I think as social scientists, we actually understand a great deal about the behavioral incentives for engaging in violence and the behavioral incentives for reducing that violence. As a political scientist, I spend a lot of time on institutional design. How do we design institutions, political mechanisms, that will decrease ethnic groups from fighting with one another, ethnic groups from coming together? How do we build institutions in sensible ways that might reduce rather than enhance violence? So in a sense, I guess I might be optimistic. I would hope that we wouldn't have worsening violence. You can imagine, individuals who can lead us possibly out of violence, but it may be that those same social institutions become nothing more than coordinating mechanisms for focusing our attention on violence and for making ourselves actually much more efficient in the way in which we engage in violence. So we do have national institutions that lead us into collectively taking ourselves out on others. So I'll leave you with that to think about. Thank you.
As always, we have time for a few questions. Let me see if I have the microphone activated. It's appropriate into service to find people who raise their hands and then hand them the mic. I'll work the other side of the room. And let's see. We've got one start here and then.
You didn't mention anything about differences you may have found for age or gender, because I know Marty Wiener sitting next to me here studies of violence in the English over the course of English history might say, I'll say this for him maybe, that there is a tendency for violence between young men, to say between 18 and 35 or 30, let's say, that you don't find in women between the ages of 50 and 70, let's say. So I'm wondering if you found any gender and or age differences in your studies.
Yes. No, you're absolutely right. I couldn't cover it all. I have an extensive amount of work on gender differences and racial and ethnic differences as well as age differences. And it's true, boys are bad, and they tend to do a lot of violence to one another in their younger ages, and eventually they grow out of it, perhaps. It's also the case, there's a considerable amount of data that I have, particularly in some of the cooperation games, about women being more cooperative under some domains. So in the public goods game, women tend to be more cooperative where the risks aren't as inherent. In the trust games, we don't find the same differences. We find huge differences across age in these, and that's one of the things that I'm struggling with. I'm not sure if it's an age cohort thing, which it may be, or merely cultural change. So the norms get redefined with different groups. Marty's lecture would lead me to be inclined to say, yeah, if we could just jail all those boys right, between the ages of 16 and 24, we'd be in good shape. But I don't think I'm going to go that far. Yes.
This is an upcoming paper by Larry Summers on that.
This is related. I wonder if you've ever gone off to Huntsville and run these things, or done it with Asperger's kids. Asperger's? Whatever.
I've actually wanted to run them in Huntsville because I think it would be an interesting population, but I'm not sure what the underlying characteristics of that population might be, whether they're whether that group of people who are incarcerated tend to not be people who are willing to put off future gains for current gains and so forth. Folks with, some people have run some of these studies on high-functioning autistics, people with Asperger's syndrome, and find that they do have a very different conception of their counterpart. But there haven't been a lot of those run. It's a difficult population I don't like to experiment on people except volunteers usually.
I'm thinking specifically of people who are sociopaths, which would be easier to find in Huntsville, but not necessarily make up the whole population.
I think that would be, yep. I think that would be very interesting, and at this point we really don't quite know where to look for some characteristics of people. If I had a little more confidence in some of the brain imaging results, that's where I might go. But then I wouldn't need a whole lot of subjects in order to do that.
Couldn't you argue that a lot of the behaviors you're testing for in your experiments could also explain violent behavior as well as nonviolent? I'm thinking of, for example, a bunch of terrorists, getting together in a plane and sort of flying it into the towers. I mean, that requires apparently a lot of cooperation and a lot of trust.
I was hoping that was going to be the point I could make clearly at the end, but you've made it much better for me, that our capacity to build social institutions turns out to be a wonderful thing for transforming violence from one-on-one violence, one person beating up another in just a seemingly random way, to now collectively organizing that violence to take on another group. And as soon as we move to that domain, I think that's a domain in which social science can talk at length about the set of institutional structures, the economic incentives, and the social incentives for large groups to act in one way or another. And as social scientists, this may be the place where we can make recommendations about how to decrease rather than increase that form of violence. So the set of the set of political institutions that we could offer would be, I think, useful in trying to stem at least violence across ethnic groups is how I often think about it.
Rick, I'm amazed at your finding of altruism in Russia. Were you able to remove the social pressures there as you did in the United States?
The question is whether we could remove the social pressures in the Russian context. No, we couldn't run these as a double-blind experiment in the same way, but we ran 5 different treatments on this particular game, and I gave you a flavor of 2 of them, and we kept trying to push social distance away, and we couldn't get rid of these very strong results. It appears that those who are contributing the most in these dictator games are engaging in costly selflessness tend to be the population, the middle-aged population actually. It's the group that grew up under Khrushchev and that bunch. And it's the youngsters who are increasingly moving away from that. And this is a group that grew up under Gorbachev and others. And we think what's happening is this is a real breakdown in norms. So we think that the altruism is not picking up just selfless behavior, but also this remnant of an old Soviet system of norms of equity that was at least sold to the citizenry, though not always practiced by its leaders. It's remarkable how resilient that 50-50 thing is. I was surprised by it as well.
People's behavior is often affected by who they think knows what they have done. And I was wondering if you have done any of these studies where people knew that other people who mattered to them or who would have their behavior influenced by them, because what people might do when only the experimenter knows or when only one unknown person knows might change considerably if they thought their peer group, their social group, someone in control, would in fact know what their behavior was.
Many people have done similar sorts of experiments. I've done some that use status differentials. And so you give someone who has a high status characteristic and they make a recommendation. And do people look up to that, follow that, and so forth. And yeah, your instincts are right. So distance matters. Distance matters a great deal, which is why it's difficult to disentangle people's innate behaviors separate from their cultural, political institutions or social institutions. Because we do look around, we pay a lot of attention to others, we have pretty powerful ways of thinking about expectations, about what others expect of us and what we expect of them. We try and match those expectations. We tend to do it more with high status than low status people, and so there's a lot of interesting combinations. But nonetheless, the patterns remain. So we can tweak them a lot, but they're still there.
Actually, I guess I have three questions, one of which the first is separate, and I'll ask it separately. In the Ultimatum game, was this a one occurrence thing, or did people know that they would be participating in a sequence of these?
We've run in many ways, but all the results I presented were one shot for the Ultimatum game.
Okay. And the second question is kind of voices a long-standing curiosity of mine about human evolution over many centuries. Is there adequate data to hypothesize whether or not societies are becoming more or less violent? And there's a related question to this in the sense that if one were to characterize a society one way or another, there seems to be a bad apple syndrome where a few individuals can exert an influence on the cultural norms of society far outside of their numbers.
Let's see, I'm trying to think of how to answer the evolution story. There's been a lot of interest by social scientists in trying to use mathematical models of games to admit the possibility of bad seeds. People who are just sociopaths, people who aren't going to cooperate under any circumstances, and then ask the question of whether or not in repeated generations, repeated interactions and so forth, whether or not kindness, altruism, prosociality can survive. And most of the models say, yes, prosociality can survive, and that it's not going to be taken over by a subset of nasties. So people have been thinking about this for some time and trying to get a sense of it. What I liked about the 15 Nation study was that people were going off to various places where the amount of exposure to Western culture was highly variable. And there is tremendous cultural variation in terms of expectations and norms in each of these societies, and yet there's still a fair amount of altruism that exists in all of these societies. So that's kind of a funny way of answering your question. It's I think you're on the right track about thinking about whether kindness can be sustained in a nasty world. I think the results that I've seen on some of the modeling indicate, yeah, sure, it can happen. And I'm actually warmed by the fact that I see so much altruistic behavior in my experiments when I move away from students and go off into what I'd call normals. So, yeah.
Let's take one more question and then give Rick a break.
I have one question. Do you think that the expression of violence is a form of ethical cooperation or can ever be deemed such?
I'm just a poor social scientist. I'm not sure how to answer ethical questions. I didn't like that finding when I first saw it. And I do think that we have a taste for punishment. And it can be used as it's nice if it can be harnessed to enforce cooperative norms. But I think it can go the other way and turn out to be a nasty facet of our nature if it can be used without.
But your willingness to include punishment means that you're admitting it as a form of ethical cooperation. You mentioned getting together collectively, institution.
Well, our culture and our institutions help define our ethical structure. I can merely note that this may be an innate part of our structure to like to punish. How that is used is in the hands of, I guess, us, and how we define that society, or the society we want to live in. So I could get into a long discussion of ethics, which might be fun, but I'm not sure I want to put the rest of these people to that. But I'd enjoy talking about it with you.
Unless we'd be accused of punishing you by overworking you, let's put our hands together for Rick. Thank you all for coming. We've got materials down in front, and we've got refreshments out in the lobby. So please join us, talk among yourselves and with Rick. That was great. That worked out really well. And this worked out really well. Yeah. You can just do a complete mop-up. Yeah.